gap between America and Cuba is more than just 90 miles of deep blue water separating Florida from Havana. It is also political, cultural, and philosophical. At first glance, there is a modern-looking infrastructure with traffic, dominated by ancient but well-kept Detroit dinosaurs. But from old Havana's cobblestone streets to the slave museums, shackles, and manacles, a picture of a defiant and well-planned republic emerges.
First traveled to Cuba in February of 1999, and I've been there every year since. And I go there, one, because for so long it was the forbidden fruit. It was a place that journalists didn't have access to. Most Americans didn't and still don't have significant access to Cuba. And so as a journalist, I wanted to know why. I wanted to know more about that society. I was curious, and my curiosity takes me back to Cuba every year. We get a lot of information on this side about why there is this strained relationship between the United States and Cuba. I wanted to know from the Cuban perspective what was going on. That's one reason why I go, but there's another reason why I go. And the other reason why I go is because Cuba is a part of the African diaspora. It was one of those transit points through which slaves flowed from the continent into the United States. But for the destination of the boat, we could all be Cubans. Our boats brought us here. They could have taken us to Cuba or Brazil for that matter. And so I think there is a linkage between Cuba, the United States, and much of the rest of the Caribbean and South America that has to be explored. Has to be explored by blacks generally, but by black historians and by black journalists. And you know, they say that journalism is the first rough draft of history, so we as journalists need to get there.
Could you tell us a little bit about the educational part?
Well, the educational mission of the school is to be a global school, to be a school that enlarges the perspective and understanding of the world for our students. One of the ways we do that is through our partnership, our memorandum of understanding with the University of Havana, more specifically with the School of Communications at the university. I think it's very exciting, the possibilities that we have, and certainly the documentary that we're working on now that explores the discovery of one side by the other, as we have students from the University of Havana and students from Morgan State University talking to each other, spending time with each other, getting to know one another. They are, in fact, potentially at least, the catalyst for change in the U.S.-Cuba policy.
No longer a struggling economy tied to the old Soviet Union, Cuba is home to noble experiments: free medical training school, low-cost housing, safe streets, and a high literacy rate.
Outside of free, what else would you say is a differentiation for you being here versus going to medical school somewhere else?
I think for me, one main thing was the academic environment, just how it's our responsibility to make sure everybody in the class is passing and has a good understanding of the content, because just within us, if we all graduate but I don't know anything, that's my community that's going to suffer.
So we do share rooms. So with the scholarship that's provided to us as U.S. students, it is a full scholarship. So that includes tuition, room and board, books, uniform, food, and your accommodation. And a stipend, a monthly stipend, which should cover your basic needs. Anything out of that, obviously, you have to come out of your pocket if you choose to. But I guess the idea behind it is that your basic needs are covered, so you should not have to pay for anything else.
Cuba history: it was the last country in this hemisphere to abolish slavery, makes black Americans cringe. More than 60 years after elbowing away its U.S. protectorates, Cuba is still faced with U.S. interference along with global criticism about human rights and heavy-handed law enforcement.
You know, Cuba has a slave history, just like African Americans have a slave history. What I find interesting and different about Cuba is that the history is told from the view of the enslaved rather than the enslaver. And so the Slavery Museum is a testimony to human spirit, the willingness, the drive to be free, and to slave rebellion. quite directly. And so going to that museum and seeing the rebellion celebrated rather than just a clinical history of these people were enslaved by this other group for this amount of time, and this is how the slaves lived, and this is what was used to keep them in line, and just kind of leave that there without context or some understanding of what slave life was like. You know, in the States we talk about sort of the workaday world of running a plantation. And so we look at the chores that the slaves did, but we don't really talk about the human interaction, the context of what the enslaved wanted, how they wanted to get free, what they did to get free. And so this was a very different kind of venue in terms of getting you to understand what slavery brought to the table. Beyond that, though, one of the things that was really compelling was when you get to the room where you see the tools that were used in the fields and the chains and the things that were used to punish slaves. And at one point, and I was looking at it more journalistically this trip, the guide picks up the manacles that were used to chain the slaves. And as she was explaining how they were used, I looked over her shoulder and I saw one of the women in our group on the verge of tears. She had her hand over her mouth. She was just in pain to think about another human being being treated that way, and especially as an African American woman, knowing that someone else of African descent was being treated that way was just a powerful and moving moment.
Still, race is the dog that doesn't bark here.
We also didn't talk about skin color as one of the last countries to abolish slavery. I expected to see more evidence of the legacy of the Atlantic slave trade manifest in the general population. You see dark-skinned Cubans, you see very light-skinned Cubans, you see some very African-looking Cubans, but I never got a sense of how all these people related in their society. In this country, there is a legacy of the Atlantic slave trade that manifests itself in how people treat each other based on the complexion of their skin. Not just whether or not they're white or non-white, or African or non-African, but light-skinned people act differently than dark-skinned people, or are treated differently than dark-skinned people. We don't like to talk about it. We don't like to talk about it in this country, and in Cuba, they didn't talk about it at all. As far as they were concerned, skin color didn't exist.
So incredible, you know, to see a black person talking like the South American style, because he was from Uruguay. I do trust in that legacy. I do trust that we have to understand what happened and that we need to exchange, to discover and rediscover, and to study.
My name is Gerald Collick. I am a multi-platform production artist here at Morgan State University, the School of Global Journalism and Communication. Reporting for Morgan State University's Digital News, WMUR, and Bear TV.